In the last video, I talked about the 10 greatest steals in the history of the NFL draft. Well, this time it's time to blast and have some fun and talk about the 10 biggest busts in the history of the NFL draft. Now, my list is, of course, subjective and it's a matter of opinion. And you know what, frankly, a lot of busts throughout the history of the NFL draft. It's harder to whittle that list of bust 'em and suck down to just 10. But that's what I sought out to do, and that's what I feel exactly like I just did. Now, honorable mention of busts that I could think of over the years. Some guys you might be surprised that aren't on the list. You look at Rick Mirer, the number 2 overall selection for the Seattle Seahawks in the 1993 draft out of Notre Dame. Apparently, they never bothered to watch Notre Dame football like I did when I was a kid, and I realized he never liked to throw to his left. He always threw to his right. It's like 90% of the time. But anyways, Seattle took him number 2 overall. The reason he's not on the list is because they once were able to take Rick Mirer and flip him around 4 years later for a first-round pick to some stupid organization that shall remain nameless. So that's why it doesn't count. Tom Cossino, the number 1 overall selection by the Buffalo Bills in the 1979 draft out of Ohio State, who decided instead of playing for the Buffalo Bills, he wanted to go make more money and play in the CFL. The only reason he's not on the list is because he was eventually traded to Cleveland for a pick that became Jim Kelly. So things like that sometimes have to be factored in. You know, I also look at when I talk about draft bust, it's a combination of being drafted way too high or just how bad they were and how disappointing they were. Other players either at their same position or at other positions, Pro Bowlers, All Pros, Hall of Famers that this team passed up on in order to take this guy. These are all things that factor in. So here we go. My top 10 NFL draft busts of all time. This should be fun. Number 10. It comes from the New York Jets in the 1980 draft. They took wide receiver Johnny Lamb Jones, number 2 overall out of Texas. Now, this is, of course, the Johnny Lamb Jones that was a part of the gold medal winning 4x100-meter U.S. relay team in the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. Apparently, they saw a guy that Texas that had great speed, world-class speed, and the Jets probably thought in their own stupidity during that time, oh my God, we're going to find us another Bullet Bob Hayes. No, they found another Johnny Lamb suck. The bad thing about this is his rookie contract, over $2 million, was an NFL record at the time to a guy who was a sprinter, who, as they found out when he came to the NFL, he could get open, but he couldn't catch the damn ball. It was terrible. Not only that, the Jets traded 2 first-round picks in order to move up to number 2 overall to be able to draft Johnny Lamb Jones. Yeah, what else makes this bad is the next pick was Anthony Munoz out of USC, who went on to be perhaps the greatest left tackle of all time in the history of the NFL for the Cincinnati Bengals. And there was a Hall of Fame wide receiver in this first round, and that was Art Monk. So, oopsie daisies. Number 9, Charles Rodgers. Woo! I remember Charles Rodgers, do you? Oh, I remember how bad he flamed out broken clavicles and getting fat and smoking dope and being addicted to Vicodin and all types of other dumb shit. This is like the crowning achievement of the Matt Millen era. It truly is. As bad of a bust as Mike Williams was in 2005 for them, as bad of a bust as Joey Harrington was in 2002, the worst bust of all for the Detroit Lions during that Matt Millen regime of terror has to be Charles Rodgers. He's a number 2 overall selection in a good draft in 2003. What makes this in particular even more ridiculous is I truly believe that Matt Millen took Charles Rodgers because he was a hometown, home area guy from right up the road in Lansing at Michigan State. The next player selected was out of Miami, Florida by the Houston Texans. They took Andre Johnson. So one is a bust who likes to beat women and smoke dope and get addicted to painkillers and break his clavicles several times. And the other guy is Andre Johnson, who's going to go on someday to become a Pro Football Hall of Famer. Oopsie daisies. Number 8, the 1992 draft of the Indianapolis Colts. You could almost argue that this is the single worst bust in the history of the NFL, but I won't go there. You could, though. You could. Because what makes this so bad for the Indianapolis Colts is they had one of those rare things. They had the first 2 picks in the 1992 NFL draft. They had pick number 1 and pick number 2. Part of what makes this not number 1 is because it wasn't really a very good draft if you go back and look at it. But at the end of the day, they still had the number 1 and number 2 overall picks. And there were still a lot of Pro Bowlers out of that draft. Maybe not a ton of all pros or Hall of Famers, mind you. But they decided to take Steve Ettman, the defensive end out of Washington, and Quentin Coryatt, the linebacker out of Texas A&M. Ettman couldn't stay healthy. Coryatt never became the player that the Colts and Bill Tobin envisioned. Who the hell is Mel Kiper? Well, I guarantee you, Mel Kiper called this stupid back in 1992. Oh, my God. They missed badly with the first 2 picks of the NFL draft. Imagine you playing Madden, you doing some bullshit Madden deal. You get the first 2 picks in the draft, and you pick one guy that sits there and can never stay healthy, never becomes a Pro Bowler, and then the other guy never becomes a Pro Bowler. Ooh. You would suck. Well, Bill Tobin sucked as a general manager for the Indianapolis Colts in the 1992 draft is his crowning achievement of suck. Number 7, Kijana Carter, the running back out of Penn State that the Cincinnati Bengals, during their reign of suck of the 90s, both as a team and as an organization when it comes to the NFL draft, they took a Penn State running back a few years after the big bust of Blair Thomas, number 2 overall. They said, hey, we can top it. We'll take Kijana Carter, number 1 overall out of Penn State. And you know what? He ended up with 1,100 rushing yards for his career. He missed several seasons because he could just never stay healthy, and you could sit there and say, well, you can't count for injuries and da-da-da. But at the end of the day, the guy was a fucking number 1 overall pick. He was never healthy. He never really did any damn thing. You knew in the 3rd play of his first preseason game when he sat there and tore his ACL that trouble was ahead for Kijana Carter, and God bless him, he's a big-time freaking bust, period. Doesn't matter how it happens. The bottom line is he was a bust. Speaking of bust, number 6, Art Schlichter. The number 4 overall selection for the Baltimore Colts in the 1982 draft out of Ohio State. Here was a guy that was revered at Ohio State. The Buckeye fans, Buckeye Nation loved him. And here's a guy that the Colts think is going to be their next Johnny Unitas, or at the very worst, at least their next Burt Jones. And instead, what they got, 4th overall, instead of taking maybe the punky QB out of BYU, Jim McMahon, they decided to take a gambling fiend who lost out on the starting competition as a rookie to Mike Pagel, of all fucking people. Mike Pagel. Of course, Art Schlichter could never win his battle against his gambling addiction and his demons, and he might even still be in prison for all the hell I know. This is one of the first I think he's the first player ever to be banned from the NFL and be banned for gambling. He never won a start in his NFL career. Think about that. That's bad. Number 5, speaking of bad, Todd Blackledge, who the Kansas City Chiefs decided, hey, he went to Penn State. That's got to be worth the number 7 overall selection in the 1983 NFL draft. The problem is that the 83 draft will always be remembered as the draft of great quarterbacks. 3 of them in the Hall of Fame, and 1 of them is not Todd Blackledge. There were several other Hall of Famers in that draft class that the Kansas City Chiefs passed on in round 1. Not only did they pass on Bruce Matthews and Jim Kelly, but Dan Marino, Terrell Green, oh God. Yes, you could sit there and say number 7 overall, and you're classifying that as the 5th worst draft bust of all time. Think about this for a second. They passed on 4 other Hall of Famers in that first round, excuse me, including 2 other Hall of Famers that were quarterbacks, the same position, just boo-boo, bad, terrible. Number 4, speaking of boo-boo, bad, terrible, is Achilles Smith, going number 3 overall to the Cincinnati Bengals in the 1999 draft. Remember, that was supposed to be the greatest quarterback class since '83, maybe the greatest of all time. He ended up with 5 quarterbacks selected in the first 12 picks. Couch at number 1 was a bust. Culpepper had an all-right career before he got injured. Cade McNown was a complete and terrible bust. But by far the worst bust of all out of those busts was Achilles Smith. He was a guy who really only had 1 good season at Oregon under Jeff Tedford's system. So the Bengals, of course, being the Bengals in the 90s and how stupid they were with their drafts over the years during that decade. David Klingler. And I could go on and on and on. The bottom line is this was just the perfect cap to the end of that decade for them. And, to make it so bad, the Cleveland Browns were very high on Achilles Smith, and they almost took him number 1 overall over Tim Couch. Otherwise, Achilles Smith might be the worst draft bust of all time. But what makes this so particularly bad is not only did they pass up on potentially future Hall of Fame players like Edgerrin James and Torrey Holt and Champ Bailey, they even passed up on Dante Culpepper, who was a much better NFL quarterback. They passed up, the Bengals did, on the chance to deal with Ditka in that 99 draft. To keep in mind, this was a Ditka that was completely consumed and obsessed with getting Ricky Williams. He was willing to trade his entire draft and some of the following year's draft to get Ricky Williams. And there was a deal in place, an offer on the table for the Cincinnati Bengals to get a total of 9 draft picks to move down from number 3 to where the Saints were drafting in order for the Saints to be able to draft Ricky Williams. And the Bengals said no. Oopsie daisies. Like I said, it kind of culminates and perfectly embodies and crystallizes what the Cincinnati Bengals were as an organization in the 1990s. They passed up on several potential Hall of Fame players in that first round, and they didn't take the fucking Ditka deal. They took Achilles Smith instead, and Bengals fans took it in the bunghole. Number 3, Ryan Leaf, the number 2 overall selection out of Washington State in the 1998 draft. What makes this so bad is not only the fact that the Chargers take him number 2 overall, but people forget that the Chargers had the number 3 overall pick in that draft. The Arizona Cardinals had the second pick. The Cardinals sat there and left it open to the highest bidder. The Chargers were the highest bidder. They just had to have either Peyton Manning or Ryan Leaf. Whoever the Colts didn't take number 1, basically. The Colts, thankfully for them and their organization, took the more mature, more polished player in Peyton Manning. The Chargers traded up 1 spot from 3 to 2. Keep that in mind. 1 spot from 3 to 2. And even though the Cardinals still took Andre Wadsworth, and he's an epic bust, and a couple picks later, the Bears took Curtis Enos, and he was an epic bust. The most epic bust of all is Ryan Leaf here in this 98 draft to the Chargers number 2. They gave up the number 3 overall pick, a second-round pick, a future first-round pick, a 3-time Pro Bowler, and Eric Metcalf, all to move up 1 slot in the draft to take Ryan Leaf. Oopsie daisies. And I believe Ryan Leaf now is serving like a 7-year prison sentence for drug problems. Yeah, epic bust. Epic bust. Number 2, speaking of epic bust, you know you're an epic bust when you were part of a top 5 in a draft class that featured 4 Hall of Famers, and you're not the Hall of Famer. That's Tony Mandrich, who Sports Illustrated said was the future of football and the greatest offensive line prospect of all time. And even Jimmy Johnson agreed and said he was the greatest offensive line prospect of all time and was very tempted to take him number 1 overall in that 1989 draft. Well, apparently they didn't do the research and realize that Tony Mandrich was on the gas. And by gas, I mean steroids when he was at Michigan State. And of course, the Green Bay Packers decided, we don't want Barry Sanders. We don't want Derek Thomas. We don't want Deion Sanders. We don't want these other 3 Hall of Famers that the next 3-team pick took with Detroit at number 3 with Barry, Derek Thomas to Kansas City at 4, and Atlanta with Deion at number 5. We don't want that. We'll take the big roided up offensive lineman because, by God, that makes sense. Oopsie daisies. Guy, he couldn't kick the roids. I don't think he ever kicked the roids, no matter what he says. He was addicted to painkillers, and he flamed out and was a complete and total bust. And when you factor in the fact that he was taken ahead of 3 Hall of Famers, and not just spread out throughout the draft where you said, well, nobody knew. No, he was one of the top 5 prospects in this draft class. Everybody agreed. Everybody thought that Tony Mandrich was at worst one of the 5 top prospects in this draft. And you have Troy Aikman go number 1, Hall of Famer. Barry Sanders, number 3, Hall of Famer. Derek Thomas, number 4, Hall of Famer. Deion Sanders, number 5, Hall of Famer. And right there, ahead of 3 of those Hall of Famers is Tony fucking Mandrich. He belongs at number 2 on the all-time biggest draft bust list. But number 1 to me has to be Jamarcus Russell. This is Al Davis and his senile over-the-hill glory in 2007. You got guys like Calvin Johnson. You got guys like Joe Thomas and Adrian Peterson and Patrick Willis and Marshawn Lynch all on the board. And you decide, hey, we took Michael Huff instead of Jay Cutler in 2006 because that made a lot of fucking sense, right? So he decided he loved Jamarcus Russell, and he realized Lane Kiffin didn't like Jamarcus Russell. So there was the first problem. The head coach didn't like the quarterback. Well, Jamarcus Russell was a great player. Get used to it. Oh, God. It's funny. For many years, people believed Ryan Leaf to be the greatest bust in NFL draft history. And Jamarcus Russell was such a big bust and such a bad player and such a bad fit for the NFL and its lifestyle. He couldn't stay away from the dinner table. He didn't work hard. He never picked up the playbook. He never did any fucking thing. Jamarcus Russell is easily the number 1 biggest NFL draft bust of all time. Let me know what you think of my list. Let me know who you think some of the biggest draft buster of all time are. Let me know. Am I right? Is Jamarcus Russell the biggest draft bust of all time? Oh, I think so.